Okay, welcome to part 2 of our introduction to religion. In the first video, we defined religion, and we defined it in a way in which everyone has a religion, as religion answers 2 questions. What happens when you die, and how do you find meaning and purpose in life? And so what religion is a system of information designed to overcome our limitations, to push us up into the right-hand quadrant of that taxonomy or typology, to engage in acts of love and altruism, all designed to increase our level of ecstasy or transcendence. And so what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to define what we mean by a believer. Because if everyone has a religion, how is everyone a believer? And so we're going to define what we mean by a believer in religion, and how does that believer use the information provided by the religious systems or multiple religious systems to overcome selfishness and evil. Let's start by defining 2 types of believers. We have simple believers and systematic believers on a continuum. What we're trying to find out here is the percent of decisions that are filtered through the religion. So how often does the believer use that system of information of the religion to filter through their words, their thoughts, their actions, their decisions that they're making? And so we have a continuum here. On the simple side, we have a very low percentage of decisions that are filtered through that religious system. On the systematic side, we have almost every decision is filtered through that religious decision. So every thought, every word, every action, which then will determine the habits, the character, and the destiny of those individuals. And so we're looking at a continuum here from simple to systematic. So if we're going to build a frequency distribution on top of this continuum, we can go ahead and build a normal distribution. And this is as close as I could get. And so in the normal distribution, the vast majority of people are somewhere in the middle between those 2 extremes, between the simple and the systematic. And let's call these people the sometimes believers. So these are the people who sometimes use their religious system to make decisions. They filter the decision process through their religious system, their words, their actions, their thoughts, through their religious system. So the vast majority of us lie somewhere between those 2 extremes. So let's dive in a little bit to take a look at these 3 different categories of believers. Now let's take a look at the simple believers. The simple believers have a very low frequency of filtering their decisions through an information system or a religion. And so Socrates may say that these people have an unexamined life, which is a pejorative on these individuals. However, we can counter that maybe, because another saying is that ignorance is bliss. And so while they're not filtering a lot of their decisions through a religious system, they may have still a blissful life. However, what we've seen so far, especially in regards to evil, is that ignorance, however, is the root of all evil. Let's take a look at the systematic side. Over here you have people who are going to filter most, if not all, of their decisions through their religious system. And you may even have people who are going to design and create their own religions by answering those 2 questions. So you've got the religious founders over here. And you also have those people who are going to reinforce that religion or reinforce the answers to those religious founders, those religious leaders. And if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there's about 1.5% of employees are categorized as part of the clergy. So you've got those individuals over here on the systematic side who are filtering through, teaching those religious systems to others. So let's take a look at some of those religious founders. You have got Siddhartha Gautama, who is known as the Buddha, who started Buddhism. You have Jesus, who started Christianity, and you've got Muhammad, who has started Islam, along with a number of other ones. Those are some of the main ones that we're going to look at. We could also look at some current founders of religion, or relatively recent religions. We've got Joseph Smith with Mormonism. We have L. Ron Hubbard with Scientology. Anton LaVey with the Church of Satan. So religions are being created all the time to answer those 2 questions, or come up with variations of those 2 questions, which may be more relevant to today's situations. And so most of us, however, lie somewhere in between. Right? We are the sometime believers who lie somewhere in between those 2 extremes. Those are the general atheists, if you will, the nominal believers, the passive agnostics, who are not looking for a systematic agnosticism, but just answer the question, I don't know what happens when you die, and then try to come up with a meaning and purpose in light of that, in a more passive way as opposed to a systematic way. So the vast majority of believers are going to lie somewhere in the middle here, between the simple and the systematic. Okay, and what these people are trying to do is just kind of get information on demand. When they've got a problem or a crisis or trying to make a decision here and there, they then will filter occasionally, and again, there's a wide variety here. They're going to filter those pieces of information. They're going to seek out information to answer those questions on the decision that they have. And so they're going to use the religious system in a more intermittent way. Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of add another component here. Besides the simple and systematic believers, we're going to add one more element or axis to this. So what we've kind of implied so far is that people only have one religion, or they use only one religious system. And that's not really true. People kind of switch between religious systems. Again, if we're trying to look at religious systems as what happens when you die and how do you find meaning and purpose, people will switch back before and between those different kinds of religions by coming up with different answers at different times. So maybe think about this. You may go, okay, well, I know what happens when you die. Something happens when you die, and you have that answer. And then maybe you say, well, I don't know what happens when you die, right? Or nothing happens when you die. And so you may actually switch back between different answers to those questions at different stages of your life. And that would be a very fluid believer. So a believer who is switching answers to those questions, both what happens when you die and how do you find meaning and purpose in light of that, is a fluid believer who's going between systems or uses multiple systems to make decisions. But then you also do have those fixed believers who are primarily using one religious system only. And so we can kind of build a quadrant here. And I'll use some management techniques to kind of have them all start with the same letter. So let's go ahead and kind of take a look at these four types of believers if we allow for those different types of definitions. Okay, the first one we kind of going to look at is the one you may have assumed or that we may have implied so far, and that is the fixed systematic believer. So the believer who is using the religious system in a systematic way, filtering most, if not all, decisions through that, or the majority of their decisions through their religious system, but also only using one religious system. And those are the pious people. We can define those as pious believers, followers of primarily one religion or only one religion, but yet following it in a very systematic way. Okay, we also can kind of look at the other side of that, in which we have people who are using information in an intermittent way, almost lightly, but they are only using one primary religious system. So these believers, we can maybe classify as principled believers. They're using those principles of that one religion to kind of make decisions as needed and as necessary. Okay, we can jump up to the fluid believers, and here we have the simple fluid believers who are trying to just get a good answer to the question that they're coming up with. So they've got a decision that's being made, and they're just trying to come up with the best practical answer to the question. They're pulling from different religious systems, right? But they're not using it in a systematic way. They're not addressing those in a systematic way. They're just kind of using those as needed, however, right? But they're using from whatever they can to come up with the best answer for the decision that's being made. And then last, you have over here the pure believers. So here you have people who are systematically trying to process all of their decisions through a religious system, but they're going to be using multiple religious systems or switch religious systems throughout their life. But they're using religious systems in a very systematic way, in a very consistent way. But they're using multiple systems, they're blending multiple systems together, but they're using religions to answer and filter their decisions through religious systems, plural. And so we've got these four different kinds of believers that we're going to go ahead and take a look at. And so the next video what we're going to do is we're going to take these four different types of believers, and then we're going to say, how do these four different type of believers use the information that comes out of religion right, to overcome selfishness and evil. Primarily, how do they use power, or where do they get power from? Where does the religious power come from that allows them to overcome selfishness and evil? And we'll take a look at that in the next video.